Coincidentally, in 1912, in a small Canadian prairie town, a new church was being constructed called St. Matthew's Anglican Cathedral. This small congregation was so moved by the tragedy of the Titanic that they chose to dedicate one of their new stained glass windows to the victims of the HMS Titanic. There are no records of any congregation members or even anyone from Brandon aboard the Titanic. So curiously now stands a 30-foot high stained glass memorial tribute to the Royal Mail Steamer Titanic, a ship that sank over 3,000 miles away from this landlocked prairie church in Brandon, Manitoba. Not only was this church touched by the tragedy, but all of Brandon was. A town with no maritime connection felt the need to help the families of the victims. In true prairie kindness, churches, concerts, theaters, and even football games were organized to raise funds for the cause, all in an effort to help strangers thousands of miles away. On the Titanic's maiden voyage were tons of cargo and 16 people destined for Manitoba. Only 4 survived. Some of the cargo lost were the expected furnishings meant for Brandon's newly built Prince Edward Hotel. Sadly, the cargo did not make it to its destination, nor did a farmhand from Eden, Manitoba, who, if it were not for a strange turn of events, would likely have been buried as one of the many unidentified victims in Halifax.
The majority of the victims of the Titanic disaster are buried in the Halifax cemetery, a cemetery I've visited a couple of times. And the interesting thing about that cemetery is that one side of it's straight, the other side is curved like the side of the Titanic, like the side of a ship, so on. So it was, they had that little aspect to it. The only victim of the Titanic disaster buried in Western Canada is buried in Neepawa's Riverside Cemetery.
In 1908, Leonard Hickman, at age 21, left his large family in Fritham, England, to work on a Canadian farm in Eden, Manitoba. It was owned by Harry and Catherine Honeyman.
Some of the people over the years figured that the Hickman ended up in Eden working with the Honeyman farm because there was a Smith family living in Eden at the same time back in those years that actually came from the same area in England as the Hickmans and was very good friends of the family. So they felt that they probably encouraged the boys to rope them, seeing there's a lot of employment in Canada and so on. And so they figured that that's how Leonard came to work in Canada.
In his 3-year stay in Canada, he worked hard as a farmhand, but he still found time to hunt and fish with his new lodge brothers. He was a member of a little-known service fraternity called the Independent Order of Foresters, with its origins dating back to England. Like a connection from home, Leonard proudly kept a membership card like this in his pocket. In 1911, he decided to travel back to England to visit his parents.
When he went to England, he was there until the spring of 1912, and he had talked to his 2 brothers coming back, and Percy Deacon, and there was a few other friends of Percy's and the Hickmans that also came over too. But prior to leaving on their trip, they were not booked on the Titanic. There was a major coal miners' strike on. All the coal required for the maiden voyage of the Titanic was going to be used, and the other ships were unable to sail, so the Hickman boys and Deacon and their friends transferred onto the Titanic. So of course we know what happened there. And when the disaster took place, the McKay Bennett was the rescue ship, or trying to find rescue and also pick up bodies. And Leonard's body was picked up. He was the only one of the Hickman boys identified, and he was identified by a Foresters Lodge card from Eden, Manitoba. That's a little village about 15-16 kilometers north of Neepawa, where he was employed. And that's how he was identified and shipped to the undertaker in town, which is Mr. Simpson. And the coincidence about that, he had a undertaker business and a furniture store all in one. He is the grandfather of Neepawa's famous author Margaret Lawrence too, so she ended up owning the business later on when grandfather passed away. I'm sitting in the pews of the 102-year-old Knox Presbyterian Church. These seats were filled to capacity on May the 10th, a Friday, with people attending the funeral of the late Leonard Hickman. The local businesses even closed to allow their staff to attend the services. The passenger train from Eden, Manitoba was delayed for a while. On the train, of course, were the Smith family and the Honeymans, where Leonard Hickman had worked, so they wouldn't very well start the funeral service until they arrived, so it did delay it for a little while.
The Honeymans arrived at the church. They went up to pay their last respects to Leonard, and viewing his body in the open casket, they realized with astonishment that was not Leonard laying in the casket, it was somebody else, who they weren't at that time sure of who it was. Mr. Honeyman immediately called the Smith family over to view the body that was in the casket. Mr. Smith noticed that this fellow was older, the fellow in the casket. He had a mustache, but Leonard did not have. So they too were concerned that this is not Leonard, it was somebody else. After a brief discussion with the Honeymans, the Smiths realized this is not Leonard laying in the casket, but is actually his brother Lewis. The Smith family, who came from the same area in England as the Hickman family, and they knew the Hickman family very well, were very satisfied that this was actually Lewis and not Leonard who was laying in the casket. Following the discovery, the Honeymans and Smiths approached the three ministers, explaining what they just seen, and that it was actually Lewis in the casket, not Leonard. The minister decided then that they would carry on with the service as is and make it public in a couple of days that there had been a mix-up in the bodies. Following the services, the citizens' band of Nipawin led the funeral procession to the Riverside Cemetery in Nipawin. For the small town of Nipawin, this could be compared to a state funeral.
Leonard's body was picked up. He was the only one of the Hickman boys identified, and he was identified by a Eden Forster's Lodge card that was in his overcoat pocket.
How Lewis ended up with Leonard's overcoat, we could only speculate. Was it in a panic with the disaster taking place, or did Leonard actually give Lewis his coat? One will never know. The grave site next to the Hickman grave is that of Emily Smith. She played a crucial part in identifying the error at the funeral service at the Knox Church, identifying it as Lewis Hickman in the casket and not Leonard. Had the Smiths not been at the funeral, we may well have had 3 more unidentified victims of the Titanic, which would have been the Hickman brothers. In loving memory of Lewis Hickman, age 32, beloved husband of Marie Hickman, also of Leonard Mark Hickman, age 24 years, and Stanley George Hickman, age 21 years.